This presentation will seek to provide information regarding the processes companies should follow for assessing whether they may be suitable to register under the R&D tax incentive. The principles detailed within this presentation are based on an AusIndustry guidance publication titled Guide to Interpretation, which is available on the AusIndustry website. The updated Guide to Interpretation document was released by AusIndustry in November of 2020 and provides information in line with the new R&D registration portal and some legislative changes to the R&D tax incentive. An accompanying fact sheet to the refreshed guidance specifically noted that the changes in the refreshed Guide to Interpretation included use of clearer language, less duplication of content, alignment with AAT and federal court decisions made since the last guidance, and modified guidance for disclosure of a hypothesis. The R&D tax incentive operates on a self-assessment framework. Self-assessment means that companies lodge their R&D applications based on their own assessment of eligible activities and may have to substantiate their activities at a later time if the claim is selected for review. The recommended self-assessment process for claimants in the AusIndustry guidance is as follows. Firstly, consider if your company is an eligible R&D entity. This usually means an incorporated company, not a trust, sole trader, or partnership. Next, consider if you have undertaken eligible R&D activities. Thirdly, consider if you can identify expenditure incurred on the R&D activities. And lastly, ensure you have kept records that describe what you did, the expenditure you've incurred, and the connection between the expenditure incurred and the activities conducted. This presentation will focus on the assessment of eligible activities phase of this self-assessment process. For the purposes of assessment under the R&D tax incentive, activities will be either eligible core R&D activities, eligible supporting R&D activities, or ineligible activities not to be registered. In order to register eligible activities in a given year, a company must conduct or plan to conduct at least one eligible core R&D activity. When assessing if a company can register activities, consider have you conducted or plan to conduct at least one eligible core R&D activity? Have you checked that the activity is not excluded from being a core R&D activity? And have you undertaken any supporting R&D activities? A company may have a year where they are only undertaking supporting R&D activities, however these must be directly related to a core R&D activity that the company plans to or has registered in another year. The definition of eligible core R&D activities is specified in the Income Tax Assessment Act 1997. The legislation states that core R&D activities are experimental activities whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience, but can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work that is based on the principles of established science and proceeds from hypothesis to experiment, observation, and evaluation, and leads to logical conclusions, and activities that are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge, including new knowledge in the form of new or improved materials, products, devices, processes, or services. If we're to break down the statutory definition, a core R&D activity must involve unknown technical outcomes, a systematic progression of work, and the intention to generate new knowledge. Each of the requirements of the legislative definition must be met to qualify, and during compliance reviews, AusIndustry need to be satisfied that a company has met each relevant criteria. If a particular part of a project is not a core R&D activity, it may still qualify as a supporting R&D activity. The first part of that legislative definition states that core R&D activities are experimental activities whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience. For an activity to be a core R&D activity, a competent professional cannot know or determine the outcome of the activity based on current knowledge anywhere in the world. A competent professional in the case of R&D tax assessments is a person who has knowledge and experience, has qualifications or can otherwise act with a reasonable level of skill, keeps up to date with developments, and has access to knowledge and resources around the world, including the internet, relevant industry journals, and other connections with other competent professionals in their field. AusIndustry also need to understand the steps a company has taken to see whether knowledge being sought was available prior to the conduct of experiments and whether any existing solutions were identified. If the knowledge sought by the experiment was available to a company without the need to undertake an experiment, it would not be considered a valid experiment for the R&D tax purposes. It's expected that claimants can show that they have conducted research into the available information in relevant scientific, technical, or professional literature and sought advice from experts in the field. The AusIndustry guidance also acknowledges that knowledge and information that is commercially sensitive, held closely by a competitor, is not available to the general public, is not considered to be reasonably accessible. The process of conducting a core R&D activity is particularly noteworthy, and applicants should sequentially describe the hypothesis being tested, the design and setup of the experiment, including key variables that will be investigated, observations, evaluations of results, and finally, logical conclusions made. The first element of the experiment is the hypothesis, which is your idea or proposed explanation for how you could achieve a particular result and why that result may or may not be achievable. AusIndustry will expect an explanation of what results you aim to achieve and how and why you think you can achieve it, informed by background research. The hypothesis will guide the investigation, and you need to be able to test it through experiments you conduct to determine the outcome of your core R&D activities. It's also important to note that the hypothesis must relate to a specific experiment or set of related experiments, and not the project as a whole, and must focus on the technical or scientific area of uncertainty, and not be framed in terms of any commercial or economic aims. Once the hypothesis is defined, the next stage involves identifying the experiment. The experiment is a scientific procedure that you undertake to test your hypothesis, observe what happens, and compare this to what you expect. It's set up so that the relationship between relevant variables can be tested, and the hypothesis can be proven right or wrong. A series of experiments may be grouped as one core R&D activity, so long as they are all aimed at testing the same hypothesis or related hypotheses. The experiment is conducted for the purposes of generating observations, which is the next key phase of describing the core R&D activity. Observation is where you observe, measure, and record information and results that relate to your experiment. Such information can be qualitative, i.e. descriptive, or quantitative, numerical data. Evaluation is where you assess and analyse the results of your experiments. You need to consider what the results of your experiment mean. This then leads to the final stage of describing the core R&D activities, making logical conclusions. Logical conclusions bring together the results, which then allows decisions to be made about whether the experiment showed the hypothesis to be right or wrong. If your hypothesis was not consistent with your conclusion, a company will generally consider whether they have to do something differently and try again. Or if it was successful, a company can consider whether they now have the knowledge needed to inform the development of the next stage of the new product, service, or process. A company must also show that core R&D activities are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. The AusIndustry guidance concedes that there can be multiple purposes for conducting an experiment, and knowledge generation does not have to be the only purpose. However, generation of new knowledge must be a significant purpose. In other words, the generation of new knowledge must be important to the company and a driving force for undertaking the activity in the first place. It's also important to note that knowledge generation must be a purpose at the time the activities are undertaken. The AusIndustry guidance states that it's not enough to undertake activities for another purpose, only to later discover that the activities were useful because they also happen to generate new knowledge. Registrants should also note the experiment must seek to generate knowledge that is new to the world. New knowledge for R&D tax purposes is that which is not already available in the public arena at the time the activities were conducted. It's knowledge that can only be generated by undertaking an experiment as part of a systematic progression of work. The guidance includes examples of what may be considered new knowledge. It may be in the form of a new product if it is a product that does not already exist in the same form, or it may be in the form of new or improved process to create an existing product or achieve some other outcome. The updated guidance also outlines the need for evidence. AusIndustry will expect that records are kept that reflect how you conduct or plan to conduct core R&D activities that are based on the principles of established science, whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience worldwide, whose outcome can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work, including the hypothesis, experiments, observations and evaluation, and logical conclusions, for the purpose of generating new knowledge, and that are not excluded from being core R&D activities. On that note, and to conclude the section of our presentation on core R&D activities, it's important to note that there are certain activities that are specifically ineligible as core R&D activities. These include market research, prospecting, exploration or drilling, management studies or efficiency surveys, research into social sciences, arts or humanities, patenting, licensing or other activities, complying with statutory requirements or standards, reproduction of a commercial product or process, and finally, software development for use in internal administration. Claimants should ensure that any potential core R&D activities do not fall into these categories. The points we have discussed so far are in respect of the criteria for core R&D activities. It's important to note that activities that are not experimental themselves, but are required for the experiment to occur, can still be potentially registered. Supporting R&D activities are activities that are directly related to core R&D activities. A dominant purpose test will, however, apply where supporting activities are related to the production of goods or services, such as where a prototype constructed to test a novel design has been sold. In these cases, the activities will not be eligible if the purpose of supporting core R&D activities was of secondary importance. To satisfy the dominant purpose test, the purpose of undertaking the claimed supporting R&D activities must be the most important purpose. Examples of how supporting R&D activities can be directly related to core R&D activities provided in the AusIndustry guidance include a literature search to refine your hypothesis before you conduct your experiment, cleaning and maintaining the equipment used during experiments, or decommissioning and dismantling equipment used in experiments after logical conclusions have been reached. Each supporting R&D activity registered must be directly related to one or more core R&D activities. In other words, the activity must have a direct, close, and relatively immediate relationship with one or more components of the relevant systematic progression of work. Supporting R&D activities may be conducted before, during, or after a core R&D activity is conducted. The key is that the supporting R&D activities must be directly related to the conduct of a registered core R&D activity. The guidance also gives examples that would not be considered supporting R&D activities. A literature review or internet search that you conducted to identify a market niche for a new product, cleaning and maintaining of equipment that was not used in experiment, or decommissioning, dismantling equipment, again, that was not used to conduct experiments. That concludes this presentation on assessment of R&D activities. Should you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with our office. There's also additional material on our website, as well as the website of the ATO and AusIndustry. Thank you.